Hi, I'm Ryan Schultz. Today I'll be taking you on a whirlwind journey through the history of disease in pre and early modern China and Japan, with an emphasis on those illnesses that frequently spread into epidemics that changed and reshaped society. We've got thousands of years of history to cover, so let's go straight to it. Writing in the Cambridge World History of Human Disease, historians Lu Guizhen and Joseph Needham tell us that the earliest records of disease in ancient China have come down to us through three sources: oracle bone inscriptions, seals and tomb objects, and a very small number of surviving texts. Surviving fragments of oracle bones take our history back to the Shang dynasty, which dates from roughly the 15th to the 11th centuries BC, more than 3,000 years ago. Ancient fortune tellers would carve questions into the surface of flat bones, such as tortoise shells or ox shoulder blades, and then heat those bones until they shattered. Reading and interpreting the cracks and lines that appeared on the surfaces, these oracles would provide answers from their divine ancestors on important matters of the day. Oracle bones that have survived thus record questions about the lives and deaths of rulers and other elite members of Chinese society. They ask about the weather, they ask about the harvest, and they ask about disease. Of course, one challenge of these unique sources is that the ideographic form of writing used in China 3,000 years ago is a little bit different from what we are familiar with today. Nevertheless, enough pieces of evidence exist over a long period of time to allow us to work backwards from later periods and read the bones. The oldest known Chinese character for disease shows a man alone, or perhaps lying on a bed, with an arrow of disease shooting into him. A variation of this character that describes a rash-causing disease actually shows the spots in the ideograph. Other characters that we know about are more abstract. They use combinations of symbols to describe maladies of the eyes and ears, of the teeth, the mouth, the abdomen, and of the various extremities. Some characters specifically depict epidemic diseases. They indicate that they came at a particular time of year and brought a regular pattern of death. None of this should come as much of a surprise. Humans have lived and died alongside the bacteria and viruses that we now know to cause epidemic diseases for our entire existence. Yet it is exceedingly rare for any society to be able to look back so far and in such detail as in the Chinese case. The Chinese record improves further with the addition of personal seals found in family tombs around the 5th to 3rd centuries BC. By this period, we can clearly see that the human answer to disease, the physician, has developed into a specialized trade distinct from the more generalized magic of earlier ages. The seal of the physician Wang, for example, indicated that he specialized in healing speech defects. Gao specialized in ulcers, Guo dealt with illnesses that caused fluid swelling, and Zhao, by contrast, was an expert in psychological maladies. This kind of specialization that we saw in the tomb seals actually led to the compilation of multifarious books of cures. But even though cures were proposed, the causes of the diseases were very poorly understood by our standards, which include an understanding of bacteria, viruses, and everything else. Instead, early Chinese medical texts tended to associate illness with the weather, suggesting, for example, that an unusually hot autumn brought fever, while cool spring weather that occurred in what should have been a hot summer promoted illnesses like bronchitis or pneumonia. While there is certainly an element of truth in this seasonality of disease, these explanations were more metaphysical than observational. Later developments evolved a more general understanding of illness as caused by problems such as the flow of qi energy throughout the body. The flow of qi could be impacted by a variety of factors, including weather, diet, sexual activity, and more, and adjusting those aspects of the qi flow were seen as ways to heal disease. But we must take care, as we think about this, to not take our modern understandings too far back into the past. Not only was disease poorly understood at the time, Even for us today, the terms for illnesses that are used in these old texts are often ambiguous. The various diseases themselves have also been hard at work over the millennia. The bacteria and viruses that cause them have evolved into different forms. They manifest differing symptoms, they've died out in one place and then risen again in another, and so on. So, with this kind of confusion in mind, forgive me then for abruptly jumping forward almost 1,000 years from these most ancient of sources. Let us simply say that from around the time of the Han Dynasty, circa 200 AD, until the 16th and 17th centuries AD in China, there isn't a large amount of detailed evidence on the spread of particular diseases, nor does there seem to have been an enormously amount of change in their treatment or understanding. This vast swath of generalization is unfortunate to be sure, but it's hard to avoid. To give just one example of the limitations of the few available sources, let me point out that Chinese imperial records surviving from the Tang Dynasty tracked disease only in terms of whether a particular outbreak was a, quote, epidemic or a great epidemic. Not even symptoms, let alone the name of the disease, was included in these records. Indeed, this information that has survived seems to have been collected mainly for tax purposes. It was never intended as a general ledger of the history of illness. So with these limitations and generalizations in mind, let us now discuss a few of China's epidemic diseases of antiquity in detail. We'll then introduce some new ones via overwater trade with Europe from the 16th century forward. Smallpox, regarded as one of China's oldest known epidemic diseases, was attested in Chinese medical treatises by at least the 6th century, when it was given the rather unbecoming name of the, quote, barbarian boils. Smallpox reappears in extant texts again by the late 11th century, when the writings of pediatricians indicate that it had become endemic to the population and was especially common among children. This is a common transition for smallpox. When it's introduced to a society, it begins as a killer of all. But as the disease becomes endemic and spreads even outside of epidemic outbreaks, a larger portion of adults catch the disease and survive, developing permanent immunity. The result is that the disease appears to gradually become more lethal to children and less lethal to adults over time, at least statistically speaking. Smallpox was certainly endemic to China throughout most of its pre-modern history, and although techniques such as induced immunity through the technique of variolation were developed to combat it, it would not be until the development and proliferation of Jennerian vaccination in the modern era that smallpox's prevalence would at last be substantially reduced in China. Malarial fevers were another common malady, and were first described in surviving Chinese medical documents around the 7th century. Most common in subtropical and tropical regions, malaria-like illnesses grew in importance to Chinese physicians during the late Song period, when the invasion and conquest of North China by the Jurchen people drove the old government into exile, essentially, in the subtropical clime of the south. Some doctors began attributing the spread of these illnesses to the particular, quote, miasma of the region. And this idea was part of a reconsideration of the source and the spread of disease in China in general. In this case, though, it was not miasma but mosquitoes that were at fault, and malaria remained common in South China well into the early 20th century. Bubonic Plague, perhaps better known by its European nickname of the Black Death, has contested origins in Asia. One genetic study found that the plague may have originated in Central Asia, along the Silk Road from China to Europe. From those border regions, it was perhaps first spread to Europe by the Mongol invaders, where it eventually developed into a pair of pandemics. First, the plague of Justinian from 541 to 549 AD, then the Black Death itself from 1346 to 1353. Neither of these two outbreaks of plague seem to have reached back to China. at least not seriously enough to cause a record-worthy number of deaths. The arrival of the plague in China proper thus comes around the late 18th century, when an epidemic of the disease began in China and spread throughout the world, killing millions. It's believed that the expansion of Chinese settlers into western Yunnan, these settlers had gone there to mine for valuable minerals. This expansion resulted in their contact with rats that were a natural reservoir of the bubonic plague. Travel back and forth from the area, combined with war and rebellion to spread the disease from its original hosts to China's population centers and ports, and from there on to the rest of the world. It was during this global pandemic, the third of its kind caused by the plague, that Chinese medical sources first began to seriously discuss what was then described as the Rat Epidemic. Let's pause for a moment. If all of these disease origin stories seem somewhat confusing, that's all right. History is rarely as neat and clean, nor as well understood as textbooks and lectures would typically lead you to believe. An important thing to remember is that this area in particular, the history of medicine, it is absolutely filled with gaps. Not only do we have to contend with gaps in the surviving records, we have to grapple with gaps in understanding even at the time these epidemics were happening. There were no universally agreed on definitions for what each disease even was. Terms and names are often more descriptive of symptoms than of causes. The same name could be used to describe what we would today consider to have been multiple different diseases if they had similar symptoms. And of course, neither the germ theory of disease nor any understanding of viral spread existed in East Asia prior to the 20th century. Although those revolutionary ideas would eventually be developed in the West and brought to China, that would not happen before European traders and imperialists had also carried a whole coterie of new epidemic diseases to China and the rest of the world. By the 16th century, the Westerners sailing and trading along China's coast had introduced scarlet fever, cholera, diphtheria, and syphilis to the country. Let's run through these illnesses as well and really fill out our pre-modern pantheon of sickness. Syphilis was probably the first of these new diseases to reach Chinese shores. It was likely introduced through the port city of Guangdong, then called Canton by the West. Guangdong was a popular destination for European traders. In fact, it was one of the only open so-called treaty ports in China. And for that reason, syphilis earned the charming epithet of the Guangdong boils. Unlike many of the other diseases we've discussed, Chinese physicians quickly and accurately came to understand that sexual intercourse was the main cause of the spread of syphilis. Yet this understanding did little to prevent the spread of syphilis, and it remained a serious affliction of the treaty port areas plied by foreigners especially. Cholera, too, seems to have come to China via Guangdong. It reached epidemic proportions during the 1820s, well into the later years of the Qing dynasty. While there is some suspicion that an epidemic in 1564 that reportedly killed 10 million Chinese may have been caused by an earlier introduction of cholera than we think, it was not until the 19th century that cholera unquestionably became an endemic disease of Chinese urban areas and a frequent epidemic threat. Scarlet fever and diphtheria reached China in the 18th century as well. They spread during the seasonal transition from winter to spring and developed into epidemics more often in the lower Yangtze and northern areas of China, in contrast to the more southerly cases of malarial fever. With that, we end our exploration of China's pre-modern diseases on something of a bleak note. We've introduced a lot more diseases, and not a lot more understanding of their true causes or of how to prevent their spread. It would not be until the collapse of the Qing dynasty into revolution that this sorry state would begin to change. And the following age of warlordism and internal collapse that spread across China meant that truly widespread relief would have to wait for the communist revolution and the subsequent remaking of Chinese society and of public health practices. Let's now head west and explore disease in East Asian history under very different circumstances. Japan, being an island nation, had a different relationship with disease than its continental counterpart. It was far more difficult for disease to reach Japan. This owed to its relative isolation, its freedom from foreign conquest, and its long history of that isolation. Once disease did come, it was often internally and unintentionally quarantined by a combination of both Japan's natural features, such as its mountains, and by human restrictions, like travel prohibitions. But when a particular virus or bacterium triumphed over these challenges and managed to grow into an epidemic, what it found was fertile ground, a highly urbanized population with no inbuilt resistances from endemic exposure to many of these diseases. Epidemics then, when they did hit Japan, tended to hit especially hard. Studying the history of epidemic disease in Japan, however, it presents many of the same challenges of missing and poor documentation as we're already familiar with for China. But we will persevere. Unlike the Chinese case, where we can go thousands of years BC back into the past, extant Japanese sources that mention disease only date back to around the 6th century AD. Japan's oldest court history recorded the outbreak of an epidemic of some variety in 552. It was likely introduced along with Buddhism from Korea. At the time, anti-Buddhists in Japan seized the opportunity to conflate the introduction of sickness with the introduction of the new religion. But it was clearly the humans who carried Buddhist icons and sutras back to Japan from Korea that brought the illness, rather than the wrath of Japan's native Shinto gods. Another Buddhist-associated epidemic came in 585, and this was possibly smallpox or measles. The next surviving record of an epidemic dates to 698. This one ushered in what historian William Wayne Farris has called Japan's Age of Plagues. Though not of the plague, the bubonic plague, but we'll get to that later. In a reversal of earlier resistance, from 700 to 1050, Japan eagerly sent travelers to China and Korea to learn of their political, philosophical, and religious developments, including of Buddhism. The critical knowledge these travelers brought back was essential to Japan's development as a state, but it carried an invisible cost in the form of attached epidemic disease. The Age of Plagues that resulted included multiple outbreaks of at least smallpox, measles, influenza, mumps, and dysentery, we think. It may also have included an encounter with the actual plague, though little hard evidence exists to confirm such an early introduction of the bubonic plague to Japan. We'll now look at each of these epidemic diseases in some detail, just like we did for China. First, known in Japanese as the funeral pox, smallpox struck particularly hard during the Great Smallpox Epidemic of 735 to 737. Remarkably detailed surviving sources suggest that this epidemic began in the northern part of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. Supposedly brought by a Korean fisherman, smallpox then spread through the port city of Dazaifu before a group of Japanese emissaries to Korea, passing through the area on their way back to the capital, carried it to eastern Japan. Various forms of Chinese, Indian, and native medicine and magic were applied to treat the malady, but none seem to have been effective against smallpox. Indeed, during this period, smallpox ravaged Japanese society, with little distinction between young or old, rich or poor. In just 1 year of the epidemic, the province of Izumi lost recordedly 44% of its adult population. The total loss of life across Japan during the period actually matches the usual 25 to 35% case fatality rate quoted for smallpox itself, making the Great Smallpox Epidemic of Japan every bit the match of the European Black Death in terms of population percentage killed. Smallpox continued to plague Japan even after this terrible epidemic burned itself out. Many of these cases were eventually traced to foreign contact, although it's difficult to assess whether that was simply Japanese xenophobia or true contact tracing, if you will. Measles was another unwelcome guest in the period from 700 to 1050. It has symptoms similar enough to smallpox to cause quite a bit of confusion to pre-modern doctors and consequently to trouble our sources, but at least 2 measles epidemics broke out during this period. One writer interestingly noted that, quote, foreigners did not die from the disease. And this is an observation that underscores Japan's unique vulnerability as an island, compared to places where measles may have been circulating more commonly and thus become endemic, thus granting a measure of immunity across the population. A more familiar one. Influenza obviously lacks the lethality of smallpox. In the pre-modern world, however, what it lacked in killing power, it made up for in ubiquity. Influenza spread in at least 6 separate outbreaks during this early period, and it hit the dense populations in the Japanese capital at Heian, today's Kyoto, especially hard. The capital also experienced at least 2 epidemics of mumps during this time. Finally, dysentery was less often a standalone epidemic in Japan as it was an accomplice that appeared alongside others, and it was especially known for tagging along with epidemic outbreaks of influenza and smallpox. These diseases reshaped Japanese society. They led to the desertion of villages, they reduced agricultural production, they restrained population growth, and they impacted tax collection measures. They also intensified social division, as the wealthy leveraged epidemic outbreaks to capitalize on shortages caused by the disease. Religion, philosophy, and even literature were all influenced by disease. In the Tale of Genji, for example, one of Japan's most beloved ancient stories, disease is perhaps the most common antagonist and killer. Brief lives cut short by disease may even have influenced the development of elite Japanese aesthetic sensibilities, which have long been characterized by an admiration of the beautiful, yet tragically short nature of life. Yet from 1050 to 1260, disease seems to have retreated in Japan. Smallpox moved from a killer of adults to a disease of children, as did measles, suggesting that both had become sufficiently endemic that immunity was not uncommon by adulthood. It was in fact influenza, for which no permanent immunity can be gained, as we know, that struck especially hard during this period. At least 5 severe flu epidemics devastated elderly Japanese in particular. The years from 1260 to 1600 were wrought by war, to which disease is a constant companion. During the 105 year from 1260 to 1420, epidemics struck at an average rate of 1 every 3.6 years, with influenza and other respiratory diseases continuing their steady march through the population unimpeded by immunity. By the 1300s, influenza and similar diseases probably killed more people each year than smallpox and measles combined in Japan. But what is most notable about the period is not the diseases that it saw, but the singularly important one it does not seem to have seen. That's the Bubonic Plague. When a combination of warriorship and fortunate weather drove back the Mongol invasions in 1274 and again in 1281, it also held off the likely import of the Bubonic Plague to Japan. Mongol warriors had carried it elsewhere on their path of conquest, and they may well have brought it to Japan had their invasion succeeded, but it didn't, and the plague seems to have been kept at bay. Other, more successful foreign incursions, however, including visits from the first Westerners around 1543, did manage to bring at least syphilis to Japan, much as in the Chinese case. After the start of the Tokugawa period in 1600, Japan grew increasingly isolated, and growing restrictions on foreign trade and commerce meant that disease remained in a relatively steady state until Japan's forced opening centuries later. Smallpox remained endemic, affecting mainly children and killing up to 10% of the population each year, until the introduction of vaccination in the late 19th century finally began to turn the tide. Measles epidemics grew increasingly rare in Japan, but when they did occur, they tended to be more deadly than smallpox. Influenza continued to claim especially the very young and the very old. And one new import during the Tokugawa period was cholera, which broke out of the foreign quarantine zone in the port of Nagasaki in 1822 and spread quickly across the country before dying out just short of the capital at Edo, perhaps due to unfavorable weather conditions for its spread. Cholera returned again in the 1850s, this time brought by the Americans who opened Japan's ports to the world by threat of force, and who simultaneously exposed the country to the full bacterial and viral environment of the many countries of the world, whose people and ideas the Tokugawa regime had long been desperately trying to keep out. The 1868 Meiji Restoration that ended the pre-modern Tokugawa regime brought rapid acceptance of Western ideas of medicine into the halls of the new Japanese government, and the island nation went on to become one of the early centers of medical research in East Asia in the modern period. The famed Kitasato Institute, founded in 1914, was instrumental in paving the way for critical developments in modern immunology. Disease has been one of humanity's constant companions throughout all of history, even if it has never been a welcome one. It has shaped and continues to shape the way our countries, nations, and societies develop over time, and it has always accompanied major periods of change. As the free flow of people and ideas continues into the future, the challenges of keeping unwelcome illness from tagging along will only grow. So far, humanity has managed, somehow, but the cost in lives, wealth, and lost human potential has been immense. As we've successfully done with smallpox, let's hope that we keep succeeding in making dangerous epidemic diseases a thing of the past.